All right, we're back here at our project, and now what we need to do is we need to take off the extra material that we left on. If you remember, when we built the face frame, we left about a 1/16, actually it's probably more like a 32nd of an inch on each side of the project. And this was so that we didn't end up with it having it too small and plywood showing. So now what we need to do is we need to come in and take the router bit and router that off on both sides, and as well as down here on the shelf. Remember, we left the shelf about a 1/16 of an inch big as well, or the front rail. That way we could shave this off and we wouldn't run the risk of plywood showing. And the way we're going to do that today is with the fixed base router, and we're going to use a flush trim router bit. And remember, anytime you grab a router bit off the wall and there's a bearing on there, you want to make sure that you can spin that freely, that it's not seized up or locked up on you, and otherwise it's going to burn your project as it's going and creating friction. So we're going to install this into the router and get this ready to flush trim the cabinet. All right, so as we take a look at this project here, we can see here's a burn mark on the project where our bearing was not free flowing and it seized up and caused a burn mark into our veneer. Now, if we have this or any other kind of defect, we do have the corner trim that we can make. Kind of looks L-shaped like this. This one has rounded corners. It wraps the front of the cabinet and the side of the cabinet to cover up any defects along the side. And you may want to use this trim whether or not you have defects. Maybe you like the way the trim looks. So remember, with any tool in the shop, we never want to assume that it's set up for what we need, or that the last person in front of us set it up for the correct application. So if there was a bit in here, we would want to make sure it's tight, that the blade is set right, and all those parameters. Someone put this back correctly. There's no blade or bit left in the machine. That's how the tool should be stored. We are going to undo this clamp in the front, squeeze both tabs, one under each handle, and the base should lift off of the router. We're going to take the collet all the way out, and we're going to make sure it's clean from any sawdust or debris into those little channels of the collet. We're going to make sure all those little channels are cleaned out by tapping and getting those cleaned out. We're going to start threading the collet back on. Make sure it goes on nice and easy. We don't want that to be stripped out, or sorry, cross-threaded. We don't want to cross-thread those threads, so we want to make sure it's going on nice and smooth. It should not take a wrench or anything at this point. Now we've got that started, we're going to take our bit and push it all the way into the collet and get that just about finger tight there. And now I'm going to pull the bit up about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to pull that bit up off of the collet so that it's not touching the collet and it's not bottomed out in the router. Now we're going to go ahead and snug that up with our wrenches. And we're going to make sure it's nice and snug. I don't have to lock this so the next guy can't get it undone, but I do want it secure so it doesn't come out or work itself loose. Now that my bit is in, I'm going to put the base back on, and if you remember from our demonstration, there's 2 pins in this base that need to line up with one of the 2 pins, one of the 2 channels on either side of the motor. Find those channels, find the pins, and line them up correctly, and they should slide into place and it should snap together. Now we need to set the height. How high up do we want this router bit? And we're going to lay the project down for this and look a little bit closer here. So as I hold the router flat against my workpiece here, what I'm looking for is the blade of the cutter to cut off at least that face frame. I don't need it to go much onto the plywood, but I do need it to overlap slightly to make sure we cut off all of the wood. And this bearing is going to ride on the plywood. So I'm a little far. I would say I'm a good 1/4 inch too far. So I'm going to back the bit up using the black collar around the motor. And again, this is unplugged while I'm doing this, never plugged in while our hands are close to the bit or cutter. So when I get that lined up and it looks pretty good where the cutter portion of the router bit is just barely clearing our solid lumber. We're good. The bearing spinning freely, that looks good. Now we're gonna lock the base into place. So now what we need to do, now that that's set, is we need to clamp down our workpiece. So we're gonna clamp this to the table, and that means that I'm gonna have to stop periodically to move the clamp or to reposition the project. But I wanna clamp it, it's pretty small. It's going to be moving on me while I router. So we're gonna clamp it down. We never wanna hold that workpiece with our bare hand. We wanna clamp it so it is secure. So because of the long distance from front to back here, I'm going to use a bar clamp and clamp it to the table. So that way it doesn't move. Now if this was a big project, maybe a cabinet making 2 project, a gun cabinet, something like that, we might be able to just lay that on the floor and it's going to stay as we router. But something small like this definitely should be clamped down so it doesn't move. And again, we're using the bar clamp here, and I'm gonna snug that to the table. And now as I router, hopefully that will stay in place. Now if you remember from using the router or the demonstration, when we router a piece of wood, we want to go counterclockwise around the workpiece. That is opposite the way the bit spins. So we're gonna start down here in this corner. We're gonna go all the way down the workpiece. We're gonna go over it again to get a nice flush cut. So 2 times, first pass removes the bulk of the material. Second pass is coming in and cleaning everything up so everything is nice and flush with the project. If this lip is really big, let's say you've got 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, then you are gonna definitely need to take more than 2 passes. Your first pass is going to be up here and the bearing is not going to ride on the plywood. You're gonna have that pulled out a little bit so that you can take several light passes. If you try to take one big pass, take a whole 1/4 inch off, you're likely going to chip out the wood and it could start tearing into your style. So light cuts, remember, with the router. We're not forcing the router to cut more than it's capable of. And we're gonna go counterclockwise. So we're ready to go, the router's set up, our project's clamped. We're going to check the cord, make sure it's in good condition, that the prongs are all there that need to be, and that they're not loose. It was bent a little bit, but it's not loose in the socket, so we're good. We'll plug this in. Now it's very critical that when I'm routering, I keep the router flat on the stiles and rails as I'm going around. Now this might be difficult as there's a very thin material here, or narrow, and our router is going to want to kind of fall because of gravity. So we need to secure this router and we need that base to stay tight. If I tip the router accidentally away from me when I'm cutting, that causes the bearing to come away from the project and allow me to cut closer. If I'm cutting and I accidentally tilt away from there, okay, the bearing goes closer and the cutter comes away. So let's take a look underneath a little bit more to see what I mean by coming closer and coming away. All right, we were just talking about keeping the router flat on the stiles, and let's take a look at that here. This would be with the router flat on the stiles, and you can see it's nice and uniform as far as how far away the bearing and the cutter is from the workpiece. Now if I'm routering along and this router comes away from the workpiece towards the operator, you can see that that bearing gets closer and the knives come away. So this really isn't going to have much of an effect on our cuts, except for it's going to leave some material uncut on the top side of the bit there. As we're routering along and the router moves towards the inside of the project, this is where the bearing now has come off the workpiece and the cutter is allowed to get closer, as that bearing is going to want to go until it hits the workpiece. So this is where we get the dips into the stiles as we're cutting. So as we're cutting along and it moves towards the inside, or we wobble, that's where we're going to get the little imperfections or dips, kind of like this one here, along the face frame style. So it's very important that we try to keep that as flat as possible when cutting. So I'm going to try to start as close to this corner as I can. If you remember, we're going to start with the bit pulled away, but the base is touching the workpiece. I'm going to turn it on, engage it, and then make our cut. Now I did a little section to show you here. Now our face frame and our project are nice and flush. You can see the point where we stopped routering. There's kind of a little lip there with the material that's left over. So now I'm going to keep it nice and flat, and we're going to cut all the way around the workpiece, but we're going to do one piece at a time. So I'm going to come to the end here, and then we're going to go over it again to make sure it's nice and clean, and then ultimately we're going to move the project around and reposition it so we can do the other sides. You'll need to look at the top of your project and determine if you need to router anything off the top or if you've got it pretty flush. If it's just very minimal, you might be able to take a sander to it. Today we're going to take the router and just lightly hit it. So we're going to get the router all set up, my bit pulled away so it can start on its own, and then I'm going to turn it on. So we're going to take a look here. You can notice up close there's a little tiny bump on the face frame where the rabbet of the plywood is. The rabbet and the cleat meet together here. My bearing was riding along the cleat, and when it hit the rabbet, there's kind of just a little step there, and so that's what that little bump is from. That is nothing that our orbital sander is not going to be able to handle. So our orbital sander would come along and sand those nice and flush at a later time. All right, we've moved our project around, got our clamp repositioned. Now we can do this other side and get this lip taken off. Again, trying to keep that router nice and flat on the stiles as we're going around the machine, or around the workpiece. So keep the machine nice and flat on the stiles. Pull the machine away so the bit can start freely. Okay, now we do not want to do the end where the bottom of the project is. That bearing sits lower than the face frame, remember? So there's no plywood until the shelf way up here. So if I take this bit and try to cut in, my router is going to go all the way up until it hits the plywood shelf. Do not try to router the bottom edge of the bottom rail. Okay, you're not going to be able to do that. We do, on the other hand, need to router the top side of the bottom rail to get this nice and flush with our project or our shelf. Now we got to be very careful because again, that bearing is following the plywood. So when I get to my ends, each end, if I just drive this over till the bearing hits, I'm going to create a little radius cut into my project. I don't want that. So I'm going to go really slow and get this lined up real close to the edge. And as I'm cutting, I'm going to go across the workpiece, and then when I get to this side, I'm going to look very carefully through the throat plate to the machine and try not to hit that stile. I can always come back later and router more, but if I router too much right away, then I'm going to have a big gouge in my project that's really going to be hard to fix. So now this, on the bottom rail, I'm going to be looking through this port here, through the throat of the machine, and watching where I am on my stile and rail. I do not want this radius to hit the stile, the radius of the bit to hit the stile. So I'd rather stop short and have to come back and do this again than mess it up the first time. Now, if you remember, counterclockwise on the outside of this board. Okay, so that means I'm going to be coming this direction on top of this board here, because that would be counterclockwise on the outside of this piece. So actually I'm going to be starting over here, and I'm going to be looking down through this little port to try to keep that lined up correct. So let's give this a try. Pull the bit away so it can start on its own. Okay, now I got that cut off, and if you look here, I've got just this little radius and a little tiny flat piece left over of material. Now we're going to need to take care of that. I can't get in there with the router. If I go any further, I'm going to end up cutting into this stile. I don't want that. Same with this side. I got a little bit of a radius, and I don't want to hit my stile. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to show you what you can do next to get rid of that little flat spot there, or that radius that you see. All right, so now we've got those radiuses on there, left down there we need to take care of. We're going to take a nice sharp chisel, and remember, 2 hands on the chisel, or 1 on a chisel, 1 on a mallet, and we're going to just take that and pop that off. So I'm going to lay that chisel as flat as I can on the workpiece and take my mallet here and just tap on that, and it should pop right off pretty evenly. Now we can come in and fine tune that a little bit and clean that up nice and flat. Do the same thing to this other side. I'm going to leave that chisel nice and flat. A little bit of a radius still there. Okay, and let's get in and take a little bit of a closer look. So after chiseling, that radius is now gone. You might see just a little indication that something was there, but when you come in with your hand sandpaper and clean this all up, that should blend in very nicely and hardly even know that there was a little radius there from the router bit. So that's how you want to take care of those little corners, is with a chisel very gently and a nice sharp chisel. Make sure you got a nice sharp edge on there before you try to do this so you don't mangle your wood. So now our project is all flush trimmed and ready to go. Now everything should be nice and even on the side, no lip. So if we put any trim, whether it's base trim on the floor or trim up the side, everything should sit nice and even. Now we're going to put an example piece up here, but this flush trimming step needs to be done before you put a top on. If it's not and you have your top on, the router can only get so close because the base is going to hit and the bit's going to be kind of in the middle of the base. So we need to do this step before you put your top on so that we can get that whole length of that side. So you may have remembered when we did our face frame, we put our jointed edges towards the inside, and that is so we have to sand a lot less later. These jointed edges are nice and smooth already. They just need a little bit of sanding to take care of them. Now the outside edges would have had our saw blade marks on there, and those are now gone because we flush trimmed off all the excess material. Let's take a look at this other nightstand. So this nightstand here has not been flush trimmed yet, and here are all those burn marks from this cutting of the workpiece. Now, if we had those on the inside, we'd have to sand all of those off. Because they're on the outside and we have a little bit to take off, when we come and flush trim this, all of those burn marks are going to disappear and we won't see them. So that's why we want the jointed edge towards the inside, because we're going to cut off the outside anyways, and those burn marks and saw blade marks are all going to disappear.